Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Executive Committee meeting of the WMATA Board of Directors for July 29th, 2021. Our first order of business this morning is to hear from our Chief Safety Officer, Teresa Impastato, for our safety contact. Teresa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Although the odds of being struck by lightning in a given year are less than 1 in a million, some factors can put you at greater risk. Lightning most often strikes people who work outside or engage in outdoor recreational activities. Regional and seasonal differences can also affect your risk of being injured by lightning. The consequences of lightning strikes are serious. Lightning is one of the leading causes of weather-related fatalities. This summer, protect yourself from lightning strikes by remembering, when thunder roars, go indoors. Find a safe and closed shelter, including homes, offices, shopping centers, and hardtop vehicles with the windows rolled up. Don't forget the 30-30 rule. After you see lightning, start counting to 30. If you hear thunder before you reach 30, go indoors. Suspend activities for at least 30 minutes after the last clap of thunder. If you are caught in an outdoor open area, act quickly to find adequate shelter. The most important action is to remove yourself from danger. While lightning strikes are rare, they can still happen, and the risk of serious injury or death is severe. Take thunderstorms seriously. For additional safety tips, visit cdc.gov. This concludes our safety contact.
Thank you, Ms. Impastato. And again, welcome everyone to the Executive Committee meeting. Our first order of business is to approve the agenda. If there are no objections, we'll consider the agenda approved as presented. Are there any objections by a committee member? Hearing none, the agenda is approved. Now we'll move on to the approval of the minutes. We have minutes of our July 15th, 2021 meeting and the executive session before us for approval. Are there any objections or comments to the minutes as presented? Hearing none, we'll consider the minutes approved as presented. Now we'll move on to our action item, the acceptance of the IG report. The one item on this morning's agenda is to accept the IG's audit plan. The Executive Committee is responsible for reviewing and accepting the OIG audit plan. The committee has reviewed the annual audit plan for fiscal year 2022. Before we take a vote, I'd like to ask our IG, Mr. Charrington, to provide the committee with any highlights of the plan. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board.
Morning.
Our 2022 annual audit plan sets forth the Office of Inspector General's strategy for identifying priority audit issues and managing its workload and resources. As with last year, our plan audits are organized around 4 focus areas: safety, reliability, and customer service, financial management, information technology, and human capital and asset management. We are currently in unprecedented times, and WMATA faces tough decisions every day, continuing to manage the COVID-19 pandemic and responding to its impacts. These audits focus on employee and customer health and well-being, financial and procurement soundness, and information technology, security, and asset management. Moreover, given the budget ramifications resulting from a reduction in ridership, several of the planned audits focus on returning funds to WMATA. I'd like to thank the Metro Board and Metro Management for their very valuable input regarding our audit plan. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Charrington. Okay, I'll open it up first to the committee members. Do any of the committee members have any questions or comments? If you'd use the raise your hand function. Okay, seeing none, I'll open it up to the other board members. Any other board members have any questions or comments for the IG? Well, Mr. Charrington, on behalf of the board, thank you very much for a comprehensive plan. Always a lot of work to do, so appreciate that.
Thank you,
Hearing that there's no discussion, acceptance of this audit plan constitutes the board's authorization to post it on the WMATA website, provided that the Inspector General has conferred with the General Counsel and has confirmed that any private or confidential information has been removed and/or redacted in accordance with applicable law and WMATA policy. I would like to move approval of this item. Is there a second from a committee member?
Second.
Seconded by Deputy Mayor Babers. Ms. Ellison, I'll ask to please call the roll.
Chair Smedberg,
Aye.
Vice Chair Babers,
Aye.
Vice Chair Slater,
Aye.
Mr. McMillan.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the motion passes.
Thank you, Ms. Ellison. The report has been accepted and the Inspector General has been authorized to post it online. Since there is no further business to come before the committee, we stand adjourned. We will now begin the Safety and Operations Committee this morning, and I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Rouse, who is filling in as Vice Chair for Mr. Letourneau, who couldn't be with us here today. So we'll just take a few minutes here before we transfer over. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning and welcome to today's Safety and Operations Committee meeting. First order of business is our agenda, which we have before us. If there are no objections, I'd like to move to approve the agenda as presented. Are there any objections? Seeing none, we will move on to the approval of our minutes from our last meeting. I trust everyone had the opportunity to review minutes from July 15th meeting. Same thing, if there are any objections to the minutes, please voice them now, and if we do not hear any, I will consider them approved. Are there any objections?
There are none.
Okay.
Mr. Rouse, before we move on, could you turn your camera on, please?
Is it not on? I can see myself.
Oh,
And it says it's on, but okay, let me turn it off and on again. Can you see me now?
yeah,
Okay.
there you go.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but
It's a good thing.
all right. So no objections to the minutes. We'll consider those approved as well. Thank you for that. We have one action item on today's agenda for the Safety and Operations Committee meeting. The board is being asked to open the Metro Rail system 2 hours early at 5 a.m. on Sunday, September 12th, 2021. And this is in support of the Cherry Blossom 10-mile run. And consistent with current board policy, the fee for this early opening would be waived. And so I'm going to ask the staff to provide the committee with a little bit more detailed overview of this request. And I believe that's going to come from Ms. Bowersox.
All right. Good morning to our chair and also all the members of the Metro Board. My name is Joseph Leader. I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer here to present a waiver of fee for early openings of the Metro Rail system. Next slide. The purpose of here today is to ask consideration for a 2-hour early opening on September 12th to encourage use of the Metro Rail system during the opening hours of the Cherry Blossom 10-mile run. Typically, this run is held during the cherry blossom season. However, because of the pandemic, the organizers postponed the race until later this fall. Opening early should provide approximately 10,000 anticipated participants that would use our system. Lynn, do you want to continue?
Thank you, Joe. Mr. Chairman, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Joe. You're just going to have to continue the slides if you don't mind. So by way of background, Mr. Chairman, this race has been run each year through this since the 90s, actually. In 2003, the board directed the staff to begin to charge a cost recovery fee for any event, asking for early or late closing of the rail system. In 2021, the board asked for staff to waive the fee for certain special events that were enumerated in the board's resolution at the time in light of COVID. And the thought behind that was to promote ridership and support the region's efforts at post-pandemic recovery. The Cherry Blossom 10-mile run was not included among those events because at the time it had been postponed without a new meetings and have detail to offer the board at that time. This month, the event organizers came forward with a request to open 2 hours early on Sunday, September 12th, which would come at a cost for Metro of $100,000 an hour. Mr. Leader has agreed that operationally that request can be accommodated. And so the staff are recommending to the board that it approve the waiver of the cost recovery fee for this event. In fact, we believe that the 10,000 people who annually participate in this event, many of whom will take Metro if we offer the early opening opportunity, will help to restore experience traveling on Metro rail system, which we think is positive for ridership in a post-pandemic timeframe. And I will also note for the board that while the run is sponsored each year by a consortium of credit unions, it is a nonprofit organization, a 501c3, and the run is offered as a fundraiser, which has contributed millions of dollars to the Children's Miracle Network hospitals. And so that is where the money that is raised from the race goes. I'm happy to take any questions that the board has regarding this request.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Bowersox and Mr. Leader. That was truly a team effort. And even though I won't touch on the irony that it was teams that caused that issue, but before we move forward, I should mention that Mr. Alcorn is here in place of Matt, our typical chair here. So wanted to get that out. I didn't say that to begin the session here, but want to make sure everyone was aware. But before we begin any questions, Q&A on this issue, I'd like to get a motion from the committee to approve this. So could I have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I would move.
Thank you, Mr.
Alcorn.
Can we get a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Drummer. All right. Are there any questions from any committee members first? Mr. Alcorn.
Mr. Chairman, to Alcorn. Just a quick comment. Just thank you to the federal government for the COVID pandemic relief funds. That's why we are and can do this.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from committee members? Okay, are there any questions or comments from other members of the board here? Okay, with that, I will ask Ms. Elson to do a roll call vote.
Mr. Alcorn,
Aye.
Mr. Rouse,
Aye.
Mr. Bulger,
Aye.
Mr. Drummer.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the motion passes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That is it. So now that's the only order of the last order of the day. We will consider it adjourned, the meeting adjourned, and I will pass it over to Mr. McMillan for the start of the Finance Committee meeting.
We'll just charge ahead, I guess, Mr. Chairman. Let me pull up my notes real quick. All right, so this is a meeting of the WMATA Finance and Capital Committee for today. I'm Chairman Steve McMillan. First order of business will be to approve the agenda. If there are no objections, we will consider the agenda approved as presented. Hearing none, the agenda is approved. And we also have before us minutes of last month's meeting for approval. Are there any objections to the minutes as presented? Hearing none, we will consider the minutes approved as presented. So today the committee has one item on the agenda, an informational item, discussion of Metro fare policy. Recently, the board approved some significant fare changes that will be implemented through the course of this fiscal year into the next calendar year as well. And given some of the significant changes that have taken place in our marketplace and our ridership in our region, the board wanted to take this opportunity to do a deeper dive into Metro's fare policy. This will be the first of multiple steps in this process. So today's presentation was designed to introduce some of the principles that we should be thinking about as we consider fare policy, and some data that we have on how fares have been used here at Metro in the past, and what we think we know about how our ridership will respond to fares going forward. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Mr. Webster and his staff to begin their presentation.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. My name is Tom Webster, Executive Vice President for Strategy, Planning, and Program Management. And as the Chairman said, today's item reviews Metro's current fare structure and fare policy principles and discusses draft potential updates to those fare policy principles. Last month, the board approved several significant customer-friendly fare changes that promote ridership, equity, and integration across modes of transit and across different transit operators. These include free rail bus transfers, a lower 7-day regional bus pass price, also including regional bus providers in our combination rail bus passes, and a $2 rail weekend flat fare. And in addition, there will be a 30-day promotion on pass products. These changes will take effect in September, so just coming up. So more than a decade ago, in 2010, the board approved Metro's current fare policy principles. And while the principles are still generally relevant, there's an opportunity to update them should the committee and board decide to do so. One example, just to illustrate, of an area to consider updating, back in 2010, Metro and the region had implemented Smart Trip, and we were at that time just beginning the process of phasing out paper fare cards. And of course, a lot has changed since then, and we've recently implemented mobile payment and have made fairly significant progress on regional integration. So what is the general purpose of fares? So fare revenue supports service and it reduces operating subsidy. And ideally, increased revenue from ridership growth can be used to support operating the service. Fare structures and levels can affect rider behavior. So in other words, how fares are charged and how much the fares are affect how much people will travel and the types of trips they will take. And fare policy, just like service policy, is about the trade-offs between different priorities and considerations. So as the board considers potential fare policy changes or fare policy adjustments, the central policy question is how to balance those objectives of ridership, revenue, and equity. A fare policy concept could significantly advance one objective, but less so another. So just as an example, discounted fares could encourage ridership, but not necessarily generate revenue. Excuse me. Other considerations as the board moves forward include, of course, the uncertainty on ridership recovery and regional recovery post-pandemic, the implications of fare evasion, and also the need to continue coordination with other transit operators in the region. Metrorail has a distance-based fare structure where customers pay a boarding charge and then are charged based on essentially the mileage of their trip up to a specific maximum fare. Fares are higher during peak weekday periods. And then on bus, fares are the same at all times of day, with higher fares for express and airport or routes that serve airports. This next chart summarizes the long history of rail and bus fares at Metro over time. Base fares have increased roughly in line over time with the Consumer Price Index, and maximum fares on the rail system have increased as the rail system expanded over the history of Metro. So as the committee and the board discussed back in May and June, the relative importance of service as compared to fares is generally similar across Metro and other agencies' customer surveys and various analyses of observed customer behavior. So when asked, our riders and other riders generally indicate that service is a higher priority. And when we analyze the effects of service and fare changes, service changes generally have a larger impact on customer decisions than fare changes. That is definitely not to say that fares are not important. As you can see in these examples, fares and affordability do show up for customers as meaningful issues and do affect their decisions. This can also vary, of course, based on the specific service or fare change or policy change that's under consideration, and the potential riders who are affected by that change. So as Metro and other transit agencies and researchers have studied and evaluated the impact of fare changes over time, there have been a number of general findings and patterns that have been observed. And I'll just hit a few of them here. Fare changes generally affect revenue more than ridership. Lower fares typically increase ridership but decrease revenue. Higher fares typically decrease ridership but increase revenue, sort of intuitive. Ridership impacts from fare service changes tend to build over time. So in the early days of a change, the impact is smaller, but then as people have a chance to adapt their own patterns to that change, a greater impact is observed. Bus riders are typically more sensitive to price than rail riders, and rail riders are more price sensitive for shorter and off-peak trips, and less price sensitive for longer peak period trips. So in addition to the significant operating cost support provided through the operating subsidy from the jurisdictions in the region, and of course, more recently, the very significant federal relief funding, many Metro riders also benefit from subsidized fares. These include discounts offered based on age or disability or participation in school or employer-based programs. They could be free rides for children under 5 to the senior and disabled fare, which is half off the peak fare. Many riders are also subsidized via participation in smart benefits programs offered to essentially pre-tax income to pay for transit, or they receive direct subsidies from their employers, including significantly the federal employee transit benefit. So a common question we hear is, how do Metro's fares and fare structure compare to other transit agencies? And while some U.S. subway and light rail systems charge flat fares, Metro Rail's distance-based fare structure is quite common among international systems and some of our peers across the globe. And it's generally recognized as a good practice as it aligns fares with how much riders travel. Charging based on distance is also common among, of course, American commuter rail systems like MARC and BRE. So in terms of cost recovery, Metro's cost recovery is generally higher than our domestic peers and other agencies across the country, and our bus cost recovery is generally lower. So importantly, when considering fare policy, transit operates in a competitive environment, and riders and potential riders have multiple options and alternatives. So the time and cost of trips influence customers' decision-making, considering that they have those options and alternatives. Transit often, not always, is cost competitive and usually the less expensive option, especially for individual trips. Transit is generally more time competitive for certain trips, especially long rail trips, and it's less competitive for trips that require transfers or long wait times. All of this, of course, varies based on exactly where a rider is starting from, where they're going, and how well the network serves their particular needs in that trip. And again, riders are not all the same, and they're going to weigh some of these factors differently depending on their own preferences and circumstances. So this is one example of a trip our team has analyzed from 16th Street to M Street downtown. For this trip, a customer has a range of potential options, including biking, ride hail, driving, using Metrorail or Metrobus. So this is an example of a trip served most directly by Metrobus, more so than Metrorail. Much of the trip time is walking to and from the bus stops and waiting for the bus. These comparisons are presented somewhat objectively here, but it's worth noting that different customers, again, will see and evaluate options differently based on their preferences. So if somebody is comfortable walking or dislikes waiting, whether they get a seat versus stand, all of those things are important. So we've included in the presentation here a number of other examples that I won't go through in detail. I'll just hit a few highlights. Buses are generally slower than other modes in these comparisons, which is one reason why it's important for the region to advance bus priority efforts that improve the speed and reliability of bus, like signal priority programs, queue jumps, and bus lanes. So different modes or combinations show up as options depending on the nature of the trip. So in this example, you see park and ride on Metrorail or bus to Metrorail. And depending on origin and destination and time of day, some modes will be much more competitive than others. And in this last example here, a longer trip from Wheelie to Farragut West, taking bus to rail is significantly less expensive than the other options that a customer or potential customer might have. So Metro is in the process of modernizing the fare collection system to restore a state of good repair and improve the customer service or the customer experience. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, we've launched the mobile payment program during this past fiscal year with Apple and Google. We have begun the replacement of our antiquated, obsolete fare gates. Our Metrobus fare box replacement project is underway, and our implementation begins next calendar year. We're also positioned to start a pilot on rear door payment on buses in late calendar 22. And we've begun initiating our market research on back office systems modernization, so the systems that support all of the customer facing interfaces, which will both improve the flexibility to support future fare policy and also replace what is really a critical system for fare collection. This next slide is really just to illustrate while customers and the general public see the interface with the fare box or the fare vending machine or the fare gate and now their mobile phone, there is a very complicated system behind that that supports it and makes it all work. So I won't dwell on this, but really critical to the long-term fare policy structure and the systems that this whole ecosystem is understood and modernized appropriately. So now moving to just fare policy concepts. Clearly, our fare policy principles can guide the development and evaluation of potential fare policy changes. So in the past, over the past year, there's been some interest in potentially updating the principles. So to start that conversation, we as staff have just drafted these potential updated principles for the committee's consideration. And they include that fares be customer focused, convenient, equitable, seamless, and essentially designed and built to drive ridership. And finally, so potential concepts to develop for consideration. We've included these in 4 major categories: pricing, targeted discounts, fare structure, and passes. And pricing could be changes to fare levels, either in rail, bus, access, or parking. In targeted discounts, it could be discounts for low-income riders or discounts targeted to encourage certain ridership patterns. Under fare structure, it could be a fairly wide range of changes, and some of these are the more structural changes that would take more time. So looking at options for how fares vary based on distance, the potential to cap fares for customers automatically, so a maximum amount paid per day or per some time period, or examining how we structure fare parking rates. And of course, like I said, the technology behind all these systems and our regional coordination is really critical here. And on passes, we could consider updates both to the short-term or monthly passes, and factor in those changes that are expected coming out of the pandemic, with potential for long-term changes in remote and telework, and split work weeks, and some of the things we've been discussing during the recovery from the pandemic. So, Mr. Chairman, that concludes the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And so I'll begin the discussion and questioning here. Again, for the benefit of the public and our fellow board members, this session is the first step in a process. We will not be making decisions here today, but exploring some of the background that will support decision-making that we might engage in later in the year. So again, mostly some comments here, and then I'll ask the staff to react to 1 or 2 of those along the way. Just a reminder to anyone listening, WMATA does not have taxing authority. We don't collect sales tax, income tax, anything like that. We get the bulk of our money from the local jurisdictions whose local elected officials make the decision on how much subsidy to give WMATA. and to leverage that investment by the local taxpayer, we have an obligation to come up with a fare policy that can allow us to build on the service that's possible just with subsidy and provide a superior product that can maximize ridership with any given level of subsidy coming from the community. So personally, at least, that's how I view our obligation as we look at fare policy. Moving to specific fare considerations for the major modes. Looking at bus fares in particular, we've had some discussion at previous board meetings amongst our colleagues about treatment of bus versus rail. And a few numbers strike me in the fare context in how to look at that balance. So in pre-COVID times, which may or may not apply going forward, bus represented about 40% of our ridership. It represented about 37% of our operating budget spending, about 25% of our capital program expenditures, although it's important to recognize that that other local taxpayer resources support the roadway that those buses ride on, which makes it distinct from rail. And then about 20% of our fare revenue was coming from bus riders during that time. So coincidentally, as was shown on one of the slides we saw earlier, we've been getting about 20% fare box recovery, meaning that of the operating expenses associated with bus, we've been collecting fares equal to about 20% of that amount, which is low compared to rail, less than half, and somewhat low compared to our peers. And whether that is the right prioritization, the right balance, I think people can debate, but I think there's reasonable justification for that. One element that may contribute to that relatively low fare box recovery, in addition to policy, unlike rail, which has a distance-based fare, we have flat fares on bus. And Mr. Webster, this is sort of a rhetorical question, but maybe you could treat it as a real question. For bus, is anything other than a flat fare practical? Zone fares or distance-based fares on bus? How would one implement that if one wanted to do it?
So technically what makes distance-based fares possible is we know because of tap in and tap out where customers are boarding and leaving the station. And they're doing that in the station, not from the train itself. On bus, a customer taps the fare box and boards the bus, and then they leave the bus without tapping again. So it would be technically and operationally quite difficult to have a distance-based fare on bus. There are some proxies for that. So I mentioned in the presentation the express bus and the buses that serve airports, where we charge a higher fare based on that those are premium services that generally travel further. There are, of course, opportunities for passes and discounts and other things like that. But a distance-based or zone-based fare structure on bus would require fairly significant change in policy and would have operational impacts, and particularly on the speed of the bus if people had to tap as they got off.
And in fact, we've discussed in the bus transformation process a bus stop option for payment that might speed the boarding process. I'm not saying that we're anywhere close to implementing anything like that, but just the challenge for the efficient bus operation to collecting the fare on the vehicle is an operational constraint.
Yeah.
Can you confirm, I think you've confirmed this for me before, that in general, looking at other systems, a flat fare structure tends to be associated with lower fare box recovery ratios?
Yes.
Okay. Given that I assume flat for bus is the structure that is most likely to prevail in almost any policy revisions we look at, what are some of the implications of that for how people use bus? So, for example, if I had a distance-based fare, I might choose to take a bus 2 stops, whereas if I'm paying the same fare, I would pay to ride 15 stops. Maybe I'm walking, maybe I'm looking at some alternative. So in terms of are there any other elements like that you can think of that affect how people use bus based on it being a flat fare that overcharges for short trips and undercharges for longer trips?
I think just in general, because of the demographics of our bus ridership, the higher the fare on bus, the more likely it will affect customer behavior. So again, if it's charged based on distance and somebody is choosing the bus based on price as compared to an alternative, or they have no choice but to take the bus to their destination, it may affect behavior more so than it does on rail.
Do we have any either data or intuition that for some riders, the lower flat bus fare might divert a rider who would otherwise take rail?
There is certainly some indicators of that. That if someone is particularly price sensitive and less sensitive about the amount of time it takes to travel, may choose, if rail and bus are both available options to them, they may choose the cheaper option and trade time for that.
Okay. Question on sort of the rider profile. Do we have demographic data showing relative average or median income levels for bus riders versus rail riders?
We do, based on customer surveys.
Okay. Do you have any of that at hand, or I can just take that as for something you can get back to me on?
I don't have it immediately in front of me, but we can follow up with that most recent.
In general, though, higher average income for rail versus
yes.
bus? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So just a final comment on observation on bus before moving on to rail. What COVID seems to have shown us, and the period immediate preceding it, is it strikes me that we have two components of bus demand to consider. We have a very we have a hardcore ridership base that needs the bus and is right and has continued to ride it throughout COVID. But prior to COVID, we were seeing on the margins declining bus ridership in a rather consistent way that persisted even after we had stabilized rail ridership. So it appears that we've got a number of bus riders who need the bus, but on the margins, perhaps we have some work to do to make bus a product that is attractive. So what we do with that, I think probably requires more thought. Moving to rail, where at least pre-COVID and with the COVID experience, we kind of have the opposite issue. For now, at least, sorry, got some background noise. Tell me if it's a problem. Rail riders have shown during COVID, at least, that they have options and they don't necessarily need rail. But at least pre-COVID, with some of the improvements we were making in the reliability of the system, it seems we had a product that was attracting more people. So that was encouraging, and what that means for fare policy going forward is unclear. One thing that strikes me looking at the rail numbers, we talk about equity as one of the considerations. And I find it interesting, at least as I read the numbers, the role of the maximum fare on rail. You had a chart showing that growing over time, and then some notes showing where there were some system expansions. But as I look at the numbers, it would appear that effectively the maximum fare in 1983 was roughly equivalent to the maximum ride you could even make in our system. And following that math forward, we are still capping fares at a distance which was equivalent to the maximum trip back in 1983. So as we look at potential adjustments, that's an area that I'm going to be paying particular attention to. That the longer distance rider over time appears to have been getting a progressively better deal relative to other riders in the system. And what I've gleaned from some previous debates over fare policy is that also tends to be the rider with the both the greater capacity and willingness to pay for that longer trip. So I'm wondering if we are missing an opportunity with the max fare as constrained as it has been in the past, and that if we are able to drive some more revenue without adversely affecting ridership too much in that area, that we might be able to do more in other parts of the system as well. Can we go to slide 11 real quick? Yeah, and just one observation in the context of this chart, that in some of these areas where the blue areas essentially represent riders who are not as price sensitive because somebody else is covering more than the normal portion of their fare. But in pretty much most of the groups in the middle of the chart, middle age range, those subsidies are coming from outside of WMATA's resources. And so that's something we need to factor in as we're considering, if we are adjusting fares, trying to incentivize behavior, incentivizing that with our own money versus incentivizing it with a third party that is trying to help us get people on the system. that may argue against going overboard with WMATA financed incentives for some of these rider groups. I don't expect a response on that. I just want to highlight for my colleagues here that who's paying for this subsidy varies throughout that. And one last question, and I apologize in advance to my colleagues for taking as long as I have. Silverline 2 coming online at some point in the near future is going to affect this equity question, since that'll be part of the WMATA system. With the purple line, at whatever point it becomes operational, while it is integrated in a significant way with our system, it is a separate system. Is there any agreement in place, or have there been discussions about fare coordination with Purple Line?
So, Mr. Chairman, I know there definitely have been discussions. I don't know if one of my colleagues has any feedback, or if Secretary Slater may know more than I do. If not, we could certainly.
Okay, well, I'll just take that for a response later. Just to me, that's something we, as we considered with the bus transfer discount policy recently adopted, that it tends to benefit riders to, think about trips as opposed to think about your bus trip and your rail trip. Presumably, both systems, Purple Line and WMATA, are counting on some cross ridership there, and so that's a conversation we should be paying attention to. That will conclude my comments and questions there. We're going to turn to other board members. If anyone wants to use the raise your hand function to chime in. I can't believe I don't see any hands raised at this point. There we go. Deputy Mayor Babers, why don't you start off?
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I had a little trouble unmuting. So, Tom, first of all, thank you and your team for, undertaking this analysis for us. I just have a few questions. Some Steve actually already hit upon. So on slide 14, when you all were, 14, 15, 16, however many of those examples that you all were providing us that I found extremely helpful, I am probably one of the, many people who will spend an hour on Trip Planner on WMATA's website trying to figure out what is my best method for getting to where I need to go, because I do not drive often, and I'm always trying to weigh the distance, the time distance, and the costs. So I found that extremely helpful. And I wonder, do we have any information as to how many people, though, truly use Trip Planner or do that type of analysis before making a transportation trip?
So I do know that it is one of the most, if not the most, used features on our website. I don't know if Ms. Barsox is here and has a sense of the volume that.
So, Deputy Mayor, you're among the customers who find this the most helpful feature on the website, and that's why it's so prominent when you go to our homepage. We track about 1 million unique visitors each month, and the majority of them are there to use the trip planning function.
So have we ever considered actually trying to make available to them other estimates of transportation options available to them? Because of course the Trip Planner only gives us the the Metro Rail and Metro Bus. But as Tom's analysis indicated, we also are checking ride hailing. We're looking at potentially walking, depending on how far that is. We're looking at driving. Is there any thought to actually integrating those mechanisms into it so that we can kind of do the analysis like you all just gave us?
So there are a number of apps that do that, that, are very popular with our riders. And we also, through Google and other partners, offer our information to the public for those kind of comparisons. And so that is available through third parties and through our open source to do those comparisons.
Okay, well, yes, and I use some of those third parties. I just didn't know if we were if Formata was thinking of doing something themselves. Next, I wanted to just mention, so the rear door payment. I mean, that's going to be a game changer. What other systems in the country or perhaps internationally currently have that feature available?
So there are some that have deployed, and we can follow up with a list of some examples. What we intend to do is a small scale pilot on a few routes across the region, and test it in our operating environment with our customers. And we'll have more detail as we lay out that plan for implementation.
Okay, and since we're always sensitive to fare invasion, do we have any information on whether rear door payments, where of course the driver is of course in the front, do we think that increases fare evasion on buses, or do we have any information or data related to that?
So that is one of the sort of key policy questions that influenced our decision to move forward with a pilot first, to try to gather some data on that. Certainly, it is a different dynamic when people are boarding away from the operator than when they're boarding right next to the operator where the fare box is today. So there are techniques that other agencies have used. I mean, there's a range of different things to try to minimize the impacts of that. And again, that's part of the plan that's going into the pilot.
Okay, great. And then my last thing is rather a comment. When we were working in DC on Reopen DC, as it related to, where are we going to be on the other side of the pandemic, we absolutely were talking about the integration of the various transit systems throughout the region. And so, of course, I think it was slide 20 that highlighted where you all were looking at trying to do those various integrations between people who are getting on a bus, then they're getting on a train, then maybe they're in Virginia now and they're utilizing Virginia's local bus service. And I don't really think that the regular transit rider understands how complex all of that is to try to integrate that. So when we get to that point of really moving forward on that, I think that it's really going to be important to communicate just how complex it is, but just it's another game changer if we can get it right. So I look forward to us really moving forward on that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
The next hand I saw was Secretary Slater.
Good morning. Thank you. Just kind of a couple of comments and really one question. First, thank you for the analysis. I thought it was really good. Your priorities that you laid out that you were hearing from your riders are consistent with what we're hearing kind of nationally. I really like the analysis comparisons that you did on the kind of the various modes, because I think many people just don't realize that that's what we're competing with every single day in terms of people's choice. But my question, I have a question around kind of the passes. I know you and I have talked about this a little bit in the past, but I'd like to understand kind of what the variety of passes that were explored. And I'm doing a lot of thinking lately about how kind of travel patterns are going to change post-COVID. And so we may have more of an environment where, someone may be in the office 2 days a week, 3 days a week versus 5 days a week. And just thinking about how we can kind of meet that need with some flexibility in passes that don't necessarily have to be on consecutive days or those types of things, so that our passes can offer the flexibility that the new work week might offer.
Yeah, Secretary Slater, appreciate that, and definitely something we're analyzing as well. I think as we talked about before, there are some product changes we could make in the near and medium term, and some that are dependent on that complicated back-end system and what flexibility we have there. So if the committee's interested, we can bring forward some range of options for consideration as part of a future conversation.
Certainly defer to my fellow committee members on consensus, but I know I'd love to explore that a little bit.
That it? Okay.
No further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Smedberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tom, thank you for sort of setting the table here. I really think we have a real opportunity here to think innovatively and really pose a lot of questions that's going to challenge, what it is we do given this new environment, something that the Secretary just said. I mean, people are clearly going to be commuting differently, using the system differently. Younger folks are going to be viewing transit differently. We see development around the region being concentrated within a quarter mile of Metro. How is that going to affect ridership? And what are we going to do as a board and as an organization to drive ridership? So I think we really have to challenge ourselves, because I think this is a real opportunity to start thinking about that and really challenging where we go. I want to say one thing, or just a couple of random comments. Tom, something you and Steve were talking about earlier, bus ridership. Prior to the pandemic, we were seeing a steady but slight decline over the years in bus ridership. Is that true? I mean, I think that's a fair statement.
Yes.
Yeah. And we were seeing an increase in rail ridership, and the system we have now, is it also fair to say that rail basically pays the bills?
I think a few different ways to look at it. Certainly.
Yeah, I'm putting it very plainly. I don't mean to.
Certainly, from a cost recovery standpoint.
From a cost recovery, it allows us to do these other things and provide some of the services we do because of that. Yeah. Tom, you've laid out that a lot of international systems have a program similar to ours. I think Steve touched upon this, and we're also mindful of the fact we have a very complex sort of funding structure here. We don't have one state, providing basically a lion's share of the funding, so that complicates matters, obviously. But I still think we have to challenge ourselves. The one thing I want to emphasize, and one thing that the deputy mayor just mentioned, is the integration. I think a lot of people in the region are looking to WMATA for leadership when it comes to this, whether it be technology integration, providing a seamless rider experience. So I think it's going to require us to really take a leadership role here and push for those kinds of initiatives, albeit they are difficult, potentially, but I think it's something we definitely have to do. The technology piece we talked about, you mentioned a few things that are happening already. I also agree with the secretary on, the idea of passes and everything. I think we definitely have to explore that. Again, given how people are probably going to be using transit in the future, the new work patterns, this pandemic has clearly sped up the whole, work from home, flexible work opportunities for folks. So we're obviously going to be dealing with something very different. And, and I think we owe it to our funding partners to really really challenge ourselves, to look at a fare structure that's going to be sustainable to the future. In a subsequent follow-up or something, it would be interesting to hear how we got to this point. Have we always sort of, we've had some changes along the way, obviously, in this system, but essentially, Tom, is this the system we've had in place since the very beginning?
From a structure standpoint, more or less, I mean, there have been changes, as we sort of talked about here, in availability of passes over time, the relative level of fares across the two modes. You see variations over time, and the issue that Mr. McMillan pointed out earlier with the max fare that has not kept pace from its early days to today. But generally, from a structure standpoint, yes, distance based on rail, a base fare on bus has been the structure, and that was intentional. And we can go a little more into that history in a future session if that would be helpful.
Yeah, and also, we have the system we have, and it is, people look at that board and they go, my goodness. And I'd also like to hear a little bit about, again, in the future, this whole peak and the peak of the peak and the non-peak. Are there opportunities there? And have you run scenarios, or have you internally discussed, some streamlining of that? As opposed to, say, a flat fare versus streamlining the system, even if we, end up with the distance-based type of fare system, how can that be sort of streamlined so it's not as complicated for folks, or doesn't seem to be, well, anyway. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do, yes. So just a couple of quick comments. Well, first, the concepts, the past concepts, and the sort of subscription-based structure is one area that we've done some work in that Secretary Slater was mentioning, and that inherently makes things simpler for the customer if their fare is capped for a period of time, a week or a month or whatever that might be. Mm-hmm. And then I think as the committee and the board discussed this spring, as we've seen the changing ridership patterns during this recovery period, and the potential for there to be, particularly on the rail side, a different pattern over the course of the day than our historic sort of peaks in the morning and the evening. Mm-hmm. That has also prompted some discussion about what makes sense from a fare structure standpoint. Is there an opportunity for simplification? Is there going to be less of a need to use fares to try to manage demand over the period of high volume ridership? Is that change going to be something that's permanent, and does that present an opportunity? So another area where we can bring back some analysis and supportive discussion.
Tom, and my last question, Steve, are there any systems out there that you are aware of, whether it be domestic or international, that say have a hybrid, that say, let's say, for instance, they have a distance-based type of fare system from opening to, say, 9 p.m. and then from 9 p.m. to closing, it's a flat fare. Is there any kind of system out there like that?
There are. And in fact, when we implement the weekend flat fare beginning September, we'll have something very similar to what you're describing. But we can identify some examples of other agencies that may do that by time of day as well. We've done over time different experiments with things like that too that we can pull back up.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir.
All right, next hand I saw was Mr. Alcorn. Walter?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Couple things I was going to say have already been said. I appreciate the comments about seamless as a fair policy principle and some of the ideas that been presented. I look forward to more analysis on that and how that can be implemented. Also, a request, some good comments about changing work ridership patterns. Let's make sure that we get some data that's available after Labor Day in particular. And let's see, how things are changing, maybe reverting back to the way they were, maybe different patterns. I realize this crystal ball is moving over time, but as much data as we could have, I think the better moving forward on that. A couple things that haven't been mentioned yet. One is the policy, fair policy principle on customer focused. Been some really good comments on the competitive fare issues, competitiveness as being important. That policy principle probably should say something more like fares need to be competitive. There might be a reason why it's not written that way, but that sounds like and looks like what it is. So that might be something to consider. And then the other thing is, I do want to make sure, and I appreciate very much the chairman's comments at the beginning of where the money comes from for Metro, and the role of local jurisdictions and the jurisdictional subsidies. Thank you very much for reminding everybody of that. I do want to make sure that going forward that there is the understanding of let's make sure that as we look at fare policy that we're keeping in mind the need for revenue neutrality as it's compared to jurisdictional subsidies. Let's not go out and change subsidies in such a way that there's more burden on our jurisdictional partners. And as somebody who serves on a jurisdictional board that sets tax rates, that's certainly something I hear about from my colleagues and constituents. And then finally, I would say it's very interesting, the discussion about particularly the long haul riders and the role of those fares in the system. Certainly going all the way back, and looking at 1983, that's kind of one perspective. But I think it's also important to remember that since about 2010 or so, but the board's policy is using CPI for fare increases that, as we've seen before the last few years pre-pandemic, we saw rail ridership decline since 2010. And, the long haul fares really did carry a lot of the load for keeping up the fare splits, the fare box recovery ratios that we wanted to keep. So I think some good points made, but let's also, there's a different time period that we could look at that as well. So great work, Tom. Keep going, and I appreciate the discussion here on the board and in the community.
Thank you. Next is Mr. Bolger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to make 3 points. Tom, thank you for an excellent presentation and got our brains all working hard. One of the first comment I wanted to make, and I'm wondering maybe Secretary Slater could weigh in here. Seems to me that gas prices have almost, at least in the district, almost hit $4 a gallon. And so are you all tracking gasoline prices, diesel, including diesel, versus how much driving we're experiencing? It seems to me in reading the transportation news that we're almost at pre-pandemic vehicular traffic rates. And if you guys could comment on that, that would be my first question.
Sure. I'm happy to kind of comment a little bit on that, Tom. From the Maryland perspective, we absolutely are tracking all aspects of transportation, and that being one of them. Our traffic overall is down about 5% compared to pre-pandemic levels. But if you look at isolated weeks of like first week of July, we were over where we were in pandemic levels. So, it varies. We have over on the aviation side, we're about 75% of where we were. Our Port of Baltimore activity is only down about 4%. On the transit ridership in the Baltimore system, we're about 60% of where we were, but that varies because we're still down 85-90% on MARC and commuter bus. But our Baltimore core bus system really is around 50%, and frankly, it's remained that throughout the pandemic, which really illustrates the importance of our core bus system to our essential workforce.
So you don't see, Greg, you don't see any correlation between high fuel costs and transit ridership at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I do see that. We see when high fuel prices go up, VMT does kind of stabilize to a certain extent, and it does it in a variety of different ways. People tend to carpool more, people tend to take transit more, but also people tend to what's called trip chain more. So, instead of going to work and going home and then going back out to the store, those types of things. So the behavior changes, but I think it certainly can influence, high gas prices can certainly influence someone choosing to take a transit trip.
So
but
Tom,
really,
I think.
But just real quick, Tom, I think the most important thing for transit is not necessarily the fuel prices. Is our customers very clearly want safer, more reliable, high quality service, and I think that's really what gets transit ridership where we need it.
Thanks, Greg. Second, this comment is I think after Labor Day, Tom, we're going to have some data regarding how many people are driving, using transit, and staying at working virtually. So I look forward to how those metrics are going to look after using Labor Day as a point in the calendar. The last comment I'm going to make, and Walter, you can tell Matt I made this, is Matt brought up whether we should be beginning the process of reinvigorating our ask regarding a regional sales tax or other kinds of potential revenue sources with Annapolis, Richmond, and the District of Columbia now, or after Labor Day, or in the fall, when we get a better sense of where we sit for the next session of the legislatures and city council. So tell Matt I raised his concern about bringing that up, Walter.
I will. I appreciate that. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. That's it, Tom.
Thank you.
All right, and next we have Mr. Rouse.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me get my hand down here. Tom, thank you. And especially for the data on page 14, where you have the data, trip time, and cost. I think I've been prodding you for quite a while now on that. So thanks for putting that out there. I do think what would be helpful in terms of adding data to that set would be some of the origin destination data in general, in terms of where people are going. So we can kind of compare us versus other modes, and particularly after everybody said Labor Day seems to be a good measuring point to see what the travel trends are. And yeah, it's going to be a mess, right? It's probably not going to be Monday through Friday. There may be peaks Tuesday to Thursday, as many people have been talking about, but we should still probably get a good sense of where most of the trips in the area are occurring, whether it's from our own data or COG data from other points, or traffic data from the streets, things like that. Because we could look at any number of routes, but we really need to focus on where people are going and where we are competitive, right? Because there's certain places we're just not going to be a viable option, and that's within DC as much as the entire region. But where we are a good option is we should really focus on using this data wisely. But look, I get it, right? If you have a fixed rail asset system like we do, where you have a very high cost to maintain it, and you can't leverage, infrastructure like roads, like the bus system can, you're always without good value capture from the real estate side. It's like climbing Mount Everest. You're always from fare policy trying to get to a point that may not be reachable. But you try to balance what you can in terms of cost recovery for having a good fare policy without driving away ridership. And, most of our value does come, has been touched on a number of times here, most of our revenue does come from that peak rail service. And it's balance. We want to be able to maintain that revenue opportunity, but at the same time, not forget about the margins, right? And that's people coming here, tourists, weekend trips. And I think you've kind of touched on that, and the chair touched on that, and how we might simplify and make the metro more of an attractive option for those that aren't regular users, right? And so it's a balance, and we got to think about both sides and how we do it. But yeah, it's an uphill battle for you. I get it. I mean, even the best systems in the world, 80% recovery, but they're leaning on other revenue streams that we don't have. And without those revenue streams, it's always going to be an uphill battle, and it's always going to be a balance as to how much we can recover without driving ridership away. So I do appreciate the data. I think there's a little bit more that we can, garner from if we have the actual O&D data to where people are going, and at what times, and how to measure that against, whether we do need a peak fare or something else, and what happens off peak as well. Where are people going, and how do we address that? And is it an issue of complexity of our fare system to begin with that drive people away? Or is it travel time and convenience? If they can drive and park for $5 and we charge them $5 just to get on the metro and then charge them again, and obviously there's a competitive disadvantage there. But I appreciate the data. A lot of work to do here. This is not an easy subject at all. And I appreciate all your hard work, Tom.
Thank you, sir.
That's all, Mr. Chair.
All right, I see no other hands up. So with that, I will close out discussion of this matter. With that, the committee stands adjourned. The Board of Directors meeting will begin momentarily.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the WMATA Board meeting of July 29th, 2021. I'm Paul Smedberg, Chair of the WMATA Board, and thank you for joining us this morning. Now I'll ask the Board Corporate Secretary, Ms. Ellison, to call the roll. Ms. Ellison.
Thank you. Chair Smedberg.
Present.
Vice Chair Babers.
Present.
Vice Chair Slater.
Present.
Director McMillan.
Present.
Alternate Director Alcorn.
Present.
Alternate Director Bulger.
Present.
Director Drummer.
Present.
Alternate Director Rouse.
Present.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Ellison. Our first order of business is approval of the agenda. I would like to consider the agenda approved with the 5 changes to the agenda. First, Mr. Goldman's service recognition. We'll do that at a later date. The Riders Advisory Council appointment. Item 9A, approval of an update to the tariff. Item 10A, the parking fee waiver at Shady Grove and Rockville. Both those items will be deferred until September. I've also been informed that the Riders Advisory Council does not have a report for us this month, so we'll be moving that from the agenda as well. So those are the 5 changes. Are there any objections to any of those changes? Hearing none, the agenda is approved as amended. Next, we'll move on to the approval of the minutes. We have 4 sets of minutes before us this morning. The June 10th, 2021 executive session, the June 24th, 2021 board meeting and executive session, and the July 15th, 2021 special board meeting. I'd like to consider these minutes approved as presented. Does anyone have any comments or questions on those 4 sets of minutes? Okay, hearing none and hearing no objections, we'll consider the minutes approved. Thank you. Next, we'll move on to public comment and reports from the advisory bodies. First, we'll hear from 5 customers and stakeholders who submitted comments to the board. Mr. Pasek.
Thank you. Can everybody see the comments on the screen?
We can.
Okay. Our first comment is from Karthik Balasubramanian from the Vision Zero Accountability Project. Metro Transit Police have lost the respect of the community and lost their authority to police. They have become ineffective and counterproductive, as evidenced by their violent abuse of children in stations. They also have repeatedly failed to investigate crimes reported, as evidenced by the shocking OIG report. Also, given that they have gamified arrests, they have demonstrated themselves to be rotten to the core. We are paying them to create public danger, not reduce it. This department needs to be dissolved immediately.
Next comment by Arthur Impasto of Alexandria, Virginia. DC should provide funding to buy only bus electric buses with a goal towards having all electric fleet by 2035.
Our next comment is from David Kubrich of the Nova Climate Coalition. Science, Mother Nature, our children, and our consciences all are telling us to do everything possible to rapidly convert to 100% renewables. Hope WMATA is listening.
Next comment, Daniel Rogers. I appreciate WMATA's plan to all electric buses, but I believe it must happen sooner. In the last few summers, we have seen the massive impact of climate change. Recent floods and heat waves show us that we need to act much more quickly. Please stop purchasing fossil fuel buses now and accelerate your timeline for full electrification.
Our final comment comes from Eularia Ramos of Montgomery County, Maryland. The policy will have a disparate impact upon both sex workers and sex trafficking survivors. Sex-related offenses include solicitation, meaning that if individuals are either soliciting for sex work, whether or not if it's of their own volition, or even suspected of soliciting, they can receive a ban. There also appears to be very little oversight of this process and a real potential to violate the civil rights of individuals during enforcement. Mr. Chairman, that concludes our public comments.
Thank you, Mr. Pasek. Okay, next we will move to the reports of the committee and want to thank everyone for their comments that they submitted. Mr. Posner?
Hi, good morning.
Good morning, Phil. How are you?
Super, thank you. July's been very interesting. We've received a number of updates from staff as WMATA prepares for the fall. The previous discussion in Finance Subcommittee is similar to what we have been talking about and getting updated on. We discussed our work plan to help address accessibility issues for the elderly and disability communities. And I have to admit, we did spend a little more time on Metro Access than Mr. Webster did, or the subcommittee did. So we will bug you about that quite a bit in the fall. The AAC is now back to full strength with the reappointment of 7 current members and the addition of 2 new members from Virginia and from the District of Columbia. DC and Access for All. Membership is active at several socioeconomic levels and disabilities. We cover vision, hearing, cognition, mobility, and we also talk about finances, which you all do quite a bit. The full AAC was led in a discussion of the equity, fares, and service during recovery, which is a large topic for the board's discussion, and a move back to normal by Peter Cafero and Mark Arvin, and he did a wonderful job of getting us updated. We also have had access to the data that Mr. Webster provided for you today. During the remainder of the meeting, Terry Anamachi presented the new fare gates that you also spoke about today, and she has been terrific in keeping the board, the group up to date with the changes and making them as accessible as possible, ranging from areas of tap-in to the sounds that are used to alert people of what's happening with their cards, whether they have sufficient funds or not. Later in July, members of the AAC participated in field testing of the new bus validator device, which again, you saw presented. And we had good access to make suggestions for improvement, to make it more accessible. We also had a demonstration of a new wayfinding technique, which is the Waymap app for wayfinding within the system. And it was very impressive. You've heard me talk about IRA in the past, and Waymap is another device that gets everyone from place to place in specific stations. And I know WMATA is working with them to make that available, and we're very excited about that. We also continue to follow the plans for Metro Access updates to their audio recording in its vehicles, as well as the new navigation system, which is being piloted for both accuracy and efficiency during trips. And that's critical, particularly for cost to WMATA, since the contract for Metro Access is based upon road hours. And so anything that improves navigation and efficiency will reduce the cost for WMATA. We were also updated on the use of child safety locks on the sedans. And this has been such item for several meetings. This was a safety issue because in the new sedans, the child locks were going on and everyone was locked into the car, including the driver. And there was a worry if something were to happen, and the accessibility of emergency workers to get people out. And that has been solved with a lot of input from the WMATA Safety Group, Metro Access Group, and also from our group. And so I'd like to say the sedans are great and they are safe. The contractor that WMATA hired to give an overview of the accessibility and usability of the website. And that was completed at the end of May with a lot of input from our group. And they presented their findings and they did a fantastic job. WMATA got more than their money's worth on that investment. The return on investment for the customers is going to be terrific. And we will be following progress of implementation of the suggestions they made to improve the usability and accessibility. Because of the pandemic, Metro Access currently limits ridership to one person per trip. And we have requested that notice of any change to this policy be communicated to the ridership well in advance of this implementation. And once again, Mr. Blake, as always, is fully cooperative with that and wanted to let you know he's agreed to doing that. And finally, we're looking forward to our next meetings in September and developing our work plan with input from ADAP, Mr. Wiedefeld, and of course the board, so as to help with a smooth return to normal, as well as the board's new policies in equity, fares, and service. And we also hope that the data gained from the bus rail fare and service pilots which are to be implemented can be used to develop an understandable flat fare and equity fare policy for Metro Access, which will be simple, acceptable to the FTA, and sustainable for WMATA. This will give Tom Webster some hard data because during the pilots, the Metro Access fares will be flat. And so the key will be, is that increasing the ridership, decreasing the ridership, and how much money is being saved in staff time and fees for the use of the fare calculator. So we're very excited about finally having real numbers of how this will affect Metro Access. And that was a busy July, and we're looking forward to relaxing in August. And our best wishes for August. And please accept our invitation to participate in any of our AAC, bus, rail, or Metro Access Zoom meetings. Again, it's a little bit easier, and we love to have you guys come and talk to us. And also, any of you who would like to join one of the members on a bus, rail, or Metro Access trip for a firsthand senior disability experience in the WMATA system. And thank you so much for listening. I know it's been a long day, and I'm happy to answer any questions, particularly from Mr. Bolger. Good to have him back.
Bill, thank you so much. Always appreciate hearing your reports, and I can say on behalf of the board that we really do appreciate all the work that you and the committee does and how cooperatively you work with staff to address the issues that are important to the group you represent. So really, really appreciate that very much. Any questions for Mr. Posner? Okay, hearing none. Thank you, Phil. And I know a lot of people are looking forward to a little break here in coming up in August. So you enjoy your as well.
Be safe in summer camp. See you in September.
All righty. Take care.
Bye.
All right, next we'll move on to the report by the chair. First, I'd like to say how deeply disappointed we are, and I personally am disappointed regarding the automatic train control, or the ACT issues at the future Potomac Yard Station that we learned about today or this week. Metro engineers determined that the original design of the ATC systems did not meet all the important safety requirements to ensure the safe operations of the trains. As a result, the station, originally expected to open in March, April of 22, is now anticipated to open sometime, hopefully in fall of 22. Although we will work cooperatively with the City of Alexandria to find opportunities to advance the opening date, we will still, and I'm sure Metro staff is still going to be placing safety at the forefront of all the decision making. Metro is accountable for this, as you all read, and we as a board expect, and our goal is to be transparent on this issue and any others like this, should they arise. So we will expect regular updates from management on this issue. Next, I'd like to remind our riders of the service improvements that Metro is implementing as the region recovers, as the region's recovery continues. As of July 18th, Metro Rail is operating until midnight, 7 days a week. On September 5th, Metro will implement several important improvements. Metro Rail will be open until 1 a.m. on Friday and Saturday nights, and will open at 7 a.m. on Sunday mornings instead of 8 a.m. We'll also increase the frequency on Metro Rail, restore service on many Metro bus routes, and increase service on several others. And to make it easier to use the whole Metro system, we'll offer free transfers between Metro Bus and Metro Rail, and a flat $2 rail fare on weekends. I encourage riders to stay tuned to WMATA.com and look for information online and at bus stops and rail stations for more details about these very exciting changes. And finally, as a reminder, the board does not meet in August, so our next board meeting and committee activities will be on September 9th. That concludes my report. Now I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Wiedefeld, our general manager. Mr. Wiedefeld.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Earlier this month, Metro's latest Doing Our Part marketing ad launched earlier this summer and highlights a number of things. The new ad is called Jamming Right Along. It continues the musical theme introduced earlier this summer and highlights the new real-time crowding information available on WMATA.com and third-party applications, expanded mobile pay options, as we've discussed, and a continued face mask wear requirement on all transit vehicles. As the region returns to work, travel, and leisure activities, Metro's Doing Our Part campaign will continue to highlight the steps we're taking to keep customers and employees safe. And next month, as more riders plan their return to school and work, we're expanding our marketing campaign to feature the major fare and service improvements scheduled for early September, which the chairman just mentioned. As for ridership, it's been gradually rising on both bus and rail since March. At this point, rail ridership has reached about 25% of pre-pandemic levels, while bus ridership is about 50%. As an aside, I can report that 85% of the commuters who are currently riding Metro Rail report that they are fully vaccinated, making Metro Rail vaccination rates significantly higher than the nation as a whole. Also, it's worth noting that we've recovered higher share of off-peak and weekend ridership compared to peak periods. For example, weekend bus ridership already hits 70% of pre-pandemic levels, whereas peak commuter travel has yet to pick up, as I mentioned. With leisure trips like shopping, dining, sporting events, and late evening travel recovering quicker than commuter trips, ridership remains much flatter through the day than before, with more retention in the off-peak periods. This aligns with the service improvements that were mentioned we have scheduled for this fall, which are designed to provide more consistent service throughout the day. As ridership continues to rebound, Metro remains ready to serve as a safe, reliable, and affordable transportation option for new and returning riders looking to get around the region once again. Mr. Chairman, that completes my report for July.
Thank you, Mr. Wiedefeld. Are there any questions for the general manager or comments? Okay, hearing none. Thank you, Paul. Appreciate that. Next, we'll move on to the report by the Safety and Operations Committee. I'll now turn the chair over to Vice Chair Rouse. Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. With the modified agenda, we only have one item to refer to the board this morning from the Safety and Operations Committee, and that is the Metro Rail early opening. Staff sought approval to open the Metro Rail system 2 hours early at 5 a.m. on Sunday, September 12th, 2021, and consistent with board policy to waive the fees associated with this event. And this early opening would support the participants in the Cherry Blossom 10-mile run, and I would like to move approval.
Thank you, Mr. Rouse. We have a motion on the table by Mr. Rouse. Is there a second?
I'll second, Mr. Chairman.
Seconded by Mr. Alcorn. Okay, we have a motion and a second. Ms. Ellison, please call the roll.
Chair Smedberg?
Aye.
Vice Chair Babers?
Aye.
Vice Chair Slater?
Aye.
Mr. McMillan?
Aye.
Mr. Alcorn?
Aye.
Mr. Bolger?
Aye.
Mr. Drummer?
Aye.
And Mr. Rouse?
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the motion passes.
Thank you, Ms. Ellison. We will move now to the reports by the committee. Again, the one consent item was deferred until September. So we'll move on to reports by the jurisdictions. NVTC, I don't have anything in particular. Mr. Alcorn, do you, on behalf of Matt?
I do not at this time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Next, the District of Columbia, Deputy Mayor Babers. Okay. WSTC, Secretary Slater.
Nothing to report from that, but I would take a minute and address the purple line question that was there earlier, that there's extensive coordination kind of happening on the engineering side right now, and then more on the operational side as we get later in the process. But rest assured that the seamless system is what we're all thinking about.
Good to hear. And last, the federal government, Mr. McMillan.
No report. Thank you.
Thank you. With no further business to come before the board, we will stand adjourned, and I will move to executive session. In accordance with the bylaws, I, Paul Smedberg, request that the Board of Directors convene an executive session to discuss the following matters pursuant to Article 2, Paragraph 9, subsections A, budgetary matters that may affect legal positions, WMATA contracts, or sensitive relationships with local jurisdictions and the federal government, and C, personnel or labor issues, including discussions of labor contracts or labor negotiations, consideration or interviews of candidates for employment, and the assignment, appointment, promotion, performance, demotion, or resignation of individuals. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Bolger. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you very much for joining us today. We will now convene an executive session. See you in September.